Good afternoon, everyone. We are still admitting our participants. So we want to thank you for your patience. We'll begin in just a few minutes. to part 2 of our Humanity First discussion series. My name is Dr. Aswad Allen. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer for Emporia State University, and it's my pleasure to join you all in a conversation about social injustice and how that relates to us as a community here and what that means going forward. The topic for today is, how did we get here? My hope is that we can explore the journey that our African-American men and women have experienced in the United States to some extent, and that we can have some real dialogue around what that means for us going forward. My goal today is for us to accomplish a few things. One is to encourage us to think about how do we learn about America and the accomplishments and struggles of African Americans. The second is how has our understanding, your families, your community, how's that understanding or knowledge of America and African Americans changed over time? And then what is the historical context or lens or point of view that you're looking at our issues from, and are there possibly points of view that you might be omitting or simply overlooking? Might you have blind sites or just simply unaware? Part 1 of our series was born out of community concerns regarding abuse of authority and distinct patterns of police brutality, most recently reflected in a number of African-American deaths, particularly with involvement with police. And that is what produced this conversation. I think in some of our news, we see that, and in some of our communities, we see that there's calls for police reform. There's requests for defunding police. There's activities and initiatives to remove Confederate monuments across the country. There's tension around these topics and issues. We have the Confederate flag at NASCAR being removed as a symbol of solidarity in some cases. And there's some common understanding, but there's still some misunderstanding. So as we move forward into our dialogue today, I'd like to allow for us to keep that within the context so that we can think about what's happening today around our country in comparison to some of our historical context that maybe we'll get into. In order to participate, I want to remind you that there are 2 audiences. We have one audience that's connected through our Zoom platform, and that audience will have the ability to raise their hands. And as I mentioned in our previous series, you'll have a hand-raising function that's at the bottom of your screen towards the center. So if you have a question or a comment, then please raise your hand. I encourage you to do that. I don't want to dominate the conversation or be the one who answers all the questions. So please participate in that way. We have a second audience, which is on YouTube. And that audience can participate by submitting their questions to emporia/live.edu. There will be a submission form that you can share your questions or comments there with. I have some great support that's helping me to manage the conversation, and I want to thank them for being part of this team. In order for us to go a little deeper, I'd like to do a few things. First, I want to thank those that participated last time for your engagement, and most importantly, for submitting the resources that has given us a nice collection of material to add to our website. So you'll find on our landing page, you'll be able to find your way to that resource list that you helped generate. I'd also like to thank our alumni specifically for their participation last time and their participation this time. They're the ones who are helping us stay connected with our broader community. So welcome to you. And before I get into any real Q&A here, I want to share my screen and see if I can get us moving along here. One of the things that I typically find myself doing is making mistakes when it comes to technology. So I'm always concerned about that. Thanks for your patience. I think I have the right screen shared, and here we go. So as I mentioned, these are three framing concepts that I'm asking us to think about. As you grew up, how did you engage in the history that you learned? Second, what do we know about the arrival of Africans in America? Now, this, unfortunately, is not the beginning. The beginning was long before this. I think there's evidence of African Americans in North America and this continent that dates back to the 1400s. There were also expeditions that involved Africans to this nation. There was a strong relationship between Africans and Native peoples, as well as there was Africans that were involved with the Spaniards, the Dutch, and the French prior to this transatlantic slave trade industry. And as indicated here, there were about 12.5 million people shipped. This is the way that many were shipped. This is considered a tight ship versus a loose ship of people, which were basically treated like cargo, cattle, less than human in most cases. There were nearly 2 million lives lost in the Middle Passage, which was one of the most horrific experiences for Africans. And I think for any type of human being, that would have been horrible. Only approximately 366,000 Africans actually ended up in the North United States in America. And so the question for me is, how did the African slave industry grow, if that's the case? As we move forward in history, we'll learn that the experiences were framed by creating laws and legislation that kept generations of Negroes, as they were called then, enslaved. You were brought here, you were placed into slavery. You were never allowed to be free. Your children also became slaves, and their children became slaves. Any woman, a white woman that married a slave, also could become a slave herself, and her offspring was indentured into servitude, slavery. In the 1700s, the law changed specifically for white women, but it didn't change for the offspring or for slaves themselves. So this is an example of the first legislation that basically dehumanized Blacks in America legally. Now, from that point on, there's a series of incidents that helped frame the construction, of our nation. In 1704, there was the first formal slave patrol. I believe that was in the Carolinas, possibly South Carolina. The slave patrol was somewhat like the policy enforcers for that time. And if they caught a slave, then they were either returned to the plantation. They were sent to another plantation if they didn't know where that sold back into slavery, if you will, or they were executed. And so there was a series of policing that took place in that time, in that manner. There's a great degree of things that happened between 1704 and 1812, but I intentionally picked 1812 because that war was I guess it was the first real attempt of the British to take the colonialism concepts and ideals and command and control them versus letting the colony separate from Britain. For you historical buffs, you probably know a lot more about that than I do. But what I will say is that Francis Scott Key witnessed, he was a prosecutor in D.C. who witnessed this war, and he witnessed the Capitol being burned down, and that inspired him, I believe, to write the national anthem. And in the third verse of the national anthem, I would encourage you all to do a little research to learn what that third verse is really talking about and how that impacts African Americans and Black people in America. It specifically speaks about basically killing the slaves who decided to join the British and fight for their freedom, which is why the national anthem has different meanings for different people, and it depends on the lens that you see this from. But please do your research there. We go on and we see the Missouri Compromise, which was a very interesting time, land exchange, and I believe that compromise dealt with Missouri being a slave, maybe the last slave state, in conjunction with land purchases related to Louisiana as well. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is a very important act of 1854 that reignited or provoked those Southern philosophies that supported the slave economy and the slave trade and that way of life. Kansas was undetermined as to whether it was going to be a slave state or a free state. But in this particular act, believe it or not, I think Kansas was going to be a slave state. That act, I don't believe, came into fruition necessarily because soon after that, the Civil War occurred. I included the Dred Scott decision here, the U.S. Supreme Court Dred Scott decision of 1857, because this court decision helped set the tone for making it legally clear that African Americans were not considered human or deserving of according the same rights that our citizens of the United States were afforded. And Dred Scott traveled. He was free, and he traveled in the free spaces. He ended up in slave territory, I believe. He wanted his freedom as a freed man, but this particular decision set the tone that that wasn't going to be the case. The U.S. Civil War and the Confederacy was born in 1861 as a result of the tensions in the United States. A few years later, the Emancipation Proclamation was disseminated across the land, but it didn't reach Texas until June 19th of 1865. As a result, the slaves in Texas were not actually freed until June 19th of 1865, about 2.5 years after freedom was declared by the president. At that time, it was President Lincoln. The 1860s, I spoke a little bit about the Southern economy and what the police force meant during that period. And in fact, there was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Many of us don't know that. So civil rights has been part of our origin for centuries. And here's evidence of there being a push for civil rights. During that time, it was important to establish civil rights because of African Americans or Blacks or Negroes being freed. And the rights of the people were unclear. Following this, the period of Reconstruction began. At the same time, there was a group of ex-Confederates in Tennessee that formed the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan was an organization designed to do its very best to preserve the way of life for the South, the way of life for Protestant white Americans. And there's a very strong belief that the white citizens should be the only citizens, and that they were superior to other peoples across the country, whether they're Native Americans or African peoples, etc. Moving on, the Jim Crow laws were put in place, which really enforced separate accommodations, which were never equal. And that was the law. And our policing enforced those laws as police are charged to do. They do whatever the law says do, and they enforce that law. And so they did enforce the Jim Crow laws during that time. Also during that time, there was a strong lynching era. And I don't need to go into any descriptors of what that was like, but I think you can imagine there was quite a bit of Black Americans that lost their lives during this stretch of our history through lynching and burning and castration, etc. 1903 to 1939, the segregation era occurred. And I think that's where we get a lot of our separate community development activities occurring. At that time, there were even businesses that were thriving in those segregated communities. But it still wasn't equal and fair access to resources and other opportunities. I threw World War I in there because Blacks did fight in World War I, that just like they fought in the Revolutionary War. They fought in World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, and all the wars that helped secure this nation's safety in relationship to other world powers and world threats. I wanted to include the 1920s because during the 1920s, there was a resurgence of the KKK, which really operated on the slogan, "Make America Great Again." These individuals wanted to return the nation to its previous glory, if you will, from that point of view. And so there was a strong push during that time, and a great degree of racism and discrimination. Sorry, I'm going to end my slideshow there. So moving forward, we can see that throughout history, we have experienced a series of legal and social and political activity that has justifiably, legally, dehumanized a group of people. And that foundation has supported some of our current legislation. When I say current or contemporary, what I'm meaning is from the 1960s all the way up to now. We have our civil rights era and movement of the 1960s, 64, and 68. We have a variety of legislative activities that occurred in the 80s and some legislative activities that are occurring now. It may be focused on different populations, DACA being one, but the issue still remains when we talk about access and opportunity, equity and fairness, and including people in this American dream. So with that, there are a few questions that came in to us in advance, and I would like to ask that some of our participants help me answer these questions. I think I have a few people that I'm going to call on, and I also want to welcome any others. We have our Libraries and Archives Dean, Michelle Hammond, who has actually experience living and working in the East Coast, having worked at Johns Hopkins University and Morgan State University, and serving well to help us improve our literature and research resources here. I'd like to invite her to participate in these questions. I'd also like to invite the Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs and Senior Diversity Officer at Fort Hays State University, who's an alum, Dr. Teresa Clouch, to help me respond to these questions. The first question is, when talking about systemic racism, what are the systems? I want to open that question up. I think Dean Hammond is with us, and I want to just ask her, based on her research and her understanding, what is systemic racism and what are the systems that we're talking about? Dean Hammond.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, that's a very multi-partite question. It has many pieces because there are many elements. There are systems. There are legal systems. There are structural systems, and you asked the question. How did we get here? I think understanding how we got here, we need to understand how we got here, if that makes sense. Yes. And your opening was excellent in giving us a timeline of how we made it to the physical space. And whilst coming to the physical space, there are structures and systems that brought us here. So the Atlantic slave trade is a system. It's an economic system. The system within the system, and there are many of those too, So during this transatlantic slave trade from the 1400s through the 1800s, there was a system of servitude. So indentured servitude, yet there was this other system that followed indentured servitude called chattel slavery. And it was very different in its core, the nature of it. So we can't explore a lot here today, but I encourage people to, as you said earlier, do your research. So indentured servitude, chattel slavery, systems, American economic systems based on servitude, indentured servitude, and chattel slavery as systems. I think that that's a good start, and I'm going to let our colleague take that from there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dean Hammond. Dr. Clouch, do you have any comments about the ideals of systemic racism and what are those systems?
Thank you, Dr. Allen, for inviting me. I greatly appreciate it. What I would look at is what systems are in place today. Dr. Hammond spoke about the history part and what is in place. And when folks talk about breaking down the system and rebuilding it and making changes, it is much of what we are experiencing now. So when we look at an opportunity to diversify our predominantly white institutions and campuses, what are we doing to have a welcoming setting, to have a place in the system that's set up that welcomes diverse people, not only as far as people of color, but as well as LGBTQ community members? How are we not just welcoming, saying, welcome to the family, but how are we helping them understand that the policies and systems in place are inclusive and not exclusive? And I think that going back to what Michelle said is that understanding how we got here is understanding how did we get here. And I agree with that.
That's interesting. Thank you, Dr. Clouch and Dean Hammond. And so, as Dean Hammond was saying, there's systems within this larger system. And Dr. Clouch is trying to get us to pay attention to the fact that we have a variety of different types of populations that make up this United States of America. And the system that we have wasn't designed to include all those different people. So when we're, working in our daily lives, in industry, in business, in education, in government, we have to pay attention. We have to give time and attention to examining how the systems in operation are supporting, including all of America that deserves to be included if we are all part of this citizenship. The challenge, however, is that you have individuals who don't recognize the subtle or overt discriminative policies, practices, or culture, and because they may benefit or they may be ignorant, one or the other, and because they don't recognize it, they're not aware that there is a thing that's operating around them that gives advantage or disadvantage by design. And that's the origin of our nation. By design, it gave advantage and disadvantage. And what we've done is we've built upon that over time. We've tried to legislate change, we've tried to make tweaks here and there. Actually, there was a time when we actually wanted to totally reconstruct the nation, and we had a high number of Black politicians and businessmen and government officials, and that was in the late 1860s and early 1870s. But that period of reconstruction was thwarted. It was stunted because those that had the power were not comfortable with sharing that power. And so they cut it off and they reverted back to the old philosophies of dehumanizing a population of people. And so we attempted to reconstruct, we failed, and we continued building layers and layers and layers onto that way. And we reached a point in the early 60s and throughout the 60s where the people, and I mean the people, not just Black people, but it was the people that said, this is not right. You know, we're dehumanizing people in our country. And they weren't in support of that anymore. Not everyone. There were some that were still in support of it, but there were some that really weren't. So then you had the tension, the civil unrest. And because those laws that were put in place were not completely infused into the fabric of our country from the 1960s until now, we're still having this residual issues. So that's one question. The next question is, how do we explain white privilege to the working class white community member or our neighbor, our colleague? How do we explain white privilege? I want to see if there's any other responders, anyone else out there who wants to respond to this. This is a conversation and I'm encouraging you to participate. So please. Gwen, do you see anyone out there?
No, I do not right now.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and see if we can talk through this a little bit ourselves. I want to encourage you all, don't be shy in this dialogue. The only way we're going to move forward as a community is to begin having these conversations together. I see Cheryl Lindsay has raised her hand. Can we hear from Cheryl Lindsay? You're on mute. Can somebody unmute Cheryl Lindsay?
Okay, can you hear me now?
All right.
Okay, when I teach intercultural communication, I talk about white privilege because it's just a thing that we talk about. When we talk about race, we talk about culture. This is a class where this is a conversation that happens. And there is an article that many of you may have read by Peggy McIntosh called Unpacking the Knapsack, or Unpacking My Knapsack, an invisible, the invisible white privilege, and I probably got that totally mutilated, the title. But anyway, Peggy McIntosh talks about how our white privilege is everything from when I go to the store and I buy Band-Aids, and I went and bought Band-Aids recently, and our Band-Aids, when I buy a Band-Aid, it comes out and it comes to my own color. You can't even see the Band-Aid on my arm because it is nude. It is whatever they want to call it, nude. And so that's the same color as my skin. It doesn't look like Aswad's skin. When I go to the store, I don't have to question whether or not I'm going to be followed in the store, even though that's happened to me a few times. But most of us as white privilege don't think twice about most of our activities on a daily basis because we're not going to experience this life in the same way that Michelle, Teresa, and Aswad are going to experience life because we are white. As a white person, we don't question getting pulled over by a police officer. You know, being Black is often scary. And being white, you don't have to be scared of being white. And you don't carry around that fear because of your skin color. You might carry around fear because you're a woman. You might carry around fear because you're an age, but you won't carry around fear because of being white. Now, you do carry around fear because of being Black. Your experience in life is based on these things that we carry. And so when you think about those privileges, and in our class, in my intercultural class, we talk about all of the experiences that everybody has and how that is communicated. When you think about your communication, what do we use? What are the behaviors that we use to communicate Blackness? What is the experiences we communicate whiteness? And whiteness is not just about language. It's about nonverbal behaviors like the Band-Aid. Whiteness is about everything from where you live, where you can buy things. In talking to students here in Emporia, there are products that are difficult and activities that are difficult to obtain in this community, like hair products or hair services. There are very few locations where Michelle can go and have her hair done in Emporia. There are other items that are difficult for you to find in this instance.
Thank you, Cheryl. I think what we can pay attention to here is the experience that you have. To what extent are you able to move through your daily life without having to think about it? As simple as that. To what extent are you able to wake up, walk out the front door, of your dwelling place and feel safe? And if you have a problem, then you can go to your neighbor, you can call the police, you can seek help without any real concern if you needed it. You can go to the grocery store, you can go to the gas station, you can go to any neighborhood that you have a family or friend or you're interested in exploring. And you can travel freely, you can have your basic needs met, and you can live accordingly. To what extent are you able to do that compared to what extent are you not able to do that? We have Dr. Jim Williams, who's our Vice President for Student Affairs, who has a comment. I'm going to let him join us if he would like.
Sure. Good afternoon. What struck me about the question was embedded in the question were opinions of clusters of groups that it's naturally assumed will not understand or that we need to educate that group on white privilege. And I think the thing that has struck me is there's been a conversation about privilege going back to Aristotle. I know enough philosophy to be dangerous, but in many of his writings, he defined the indentured components of culture. Then you look at our religion and the development of our Christianity, and you can just simply look in the Bible and color of skin is used as a punishment and is made, quote, to be something you don't want to be affiliated with, and et cetera. And so colonial America brought the concept of white privilege as early as Jamestown settlements in the beliefs and doctrines that were developed. And so I think for white people, I don't think you can classify groups as saying, well, that group over there doesn't understand white privilege. I think we have a responsibility to unpack ourselves.
Right.
And what is that within us that we understand or don't understand, and start to look at where are those crossovers where I didn't have to worry about that because I have privilege. And so I think having a conversation as a campus it's very dangerous to start to segment populations that we're going to assume have less knowledge or interest. I think we have to take a step back and say, this is a conversation for everyone, and facilitate it in that manner.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Williams. It's important to also give the space for people to reflect on where they are and give that support and encouragement for self growth and self evaluation. I believe one of the things that I've learned is that if you want to know the story of anything, you have to be willing to do the work to find out. African Americans haven't been the only population in this country that's been, I would say, oppressed. We have a list, I think, that we could go through. However, the ideal of this conversation is to encourage everyone to begin that process of learning why are some of the things that might make us feel uncomfortable, why do they make us feel uncomfortable? And what is it based on? What are we doing to address the new information and new knowledge that we gain in our daily lives? And how are we taking the steps to move forward individually, professionally, and as a community? It's hard to be willing to take action on anything if you're not even aware that there's a problem. And typically what we've seen is that for those that have raised their hand and haven't been seen, and raised their voice and haven't been heard, and are only responded to when they've had enough and they begin to put their very lives on the line to push for change. It seems that those individuals are called the problem. Now, there may be some problems with that, but I think we have to be willing to look at the root of the matter in order to understand the fruit, that's coming out of it. So let's move on. There is a comment here that says we need to take this unpredictable time that we're living as an opportunity to rise spiritually with our family, friends, and community. That is very true, in my opinion. But I want to see if there's any comments to that. Gene has his hand raised. I think that's Gene maybe McIntosh. Do you have any comments?
Right. Gene McIntosh.
Yes.
And my my connection with Emporia State is with the Alumni Association Board, and my comment and so on relates just you said in conversation with family and friends, and it has to do with the systemic racism. As I'm talking with some of my family friends, the comments of, well, I'm not racist. I have I have a family member who is white, who is married to a black person, and grandchildren are white and black. And I'm not racist. I love them. True. So what I'm pointing to is the kind of the individual things that, I'm friends with a number of folks that are not white. And so I'm not racist. How am I racist? So that systemic racism then, trying to help or trying to, talk about systemic racism and what that is what, as I see it. And the response to that, one of the responses is that, systemic racism, that's not a thing. I don't believe in that. And I heard that some political circles also. But that belief just shuts down, or has shut down conversation. I can say, well, I think that this is happening, though, which can connect to white privilege and the system of our European white heritage that made all the rules and so on. And but seems like getting past first base is difficult because I don't believe systemic racism exists.
Getting past first base is difficult.
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking to family who you love and you want to engage with, but there's tension. And getting past first base is difficult when you're talking to people that you don't love too. But I think that for me, the key is to, whether you believe something is true or not, find out. If you don't believe it's true, find out. If you do believe it's true, find out. Let's be willing to walk this journey together. And let's be willing to go outside the normal media sources and look at actual evidence-based information that can help us have a better understanding of what it is we're even talking about. If we move out of the space of opinion and begin to challenge each other in evidence gathering, then we'll more likely than not come to a common conclusion. We will say that in some instances, these issues have been used as lightning rods, but in other issues, in other cases, we can clearly see that we're not even talking about the bulk of the matter. We're simply seeing what we're being presented. If you actually do the research, you're going to find yourself walking down a path with your family member to get to some common conclusions and some common discoveries. So it's not so much of challenging, in my mind, challenging what a person believes. Is more challenging what a person concludes. You believe what you want to believe, but let's search for the conclusion here. Let's search for the story. Let's search for the evidence. Let's do it together as a family, and let's be honest about it. Most people who are talking about our country right now love this country, okay? They love this country. It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what your belief system is. If you're here in this nation and you are passionate about whether you believe something or not, it's because you love the country that you're a part of. And the point here is that you want to create a fair and equitable experience for all of our citizens, and you want America to be the dream that it's been promised to be for everyone. You would hate to believe that you're part of a system that is designed to imbalance opportunity, to privilege opportunity with one group over another. You would hate to believe that, but I would suggest that let's test that out, you know, and do some exploration and some research to see where the truth resides. And my comment here in response to I'm not a racist is, if you are not a racist, does that mean that you're for or against racism? What does that mean? Are you hot or cold? Against or with? Are you for humanity for all people, or are you for humanity for a select few? These are the questions that I think when someone says, I'm not a racist, I think that we should ask, you know, well, what does that mean? You know, are you for people to have human rights equally, or are you for some to have human rights and others to not have those rights? There was a question about the spiritual element here. And I'm not going to go into that deeply, but I will say that, you know, our nation has been presented as being one that is under God we trust. And I'm not sure what that means to people. So we can talk a little bit about that element, but silence is complicit. If you see somebody being murdered or raped and you don't call 911 or you don't intervene, then you're not necessarily for rape or for murder, but are you trying to prevent it? You have the opportunity to. So we're talking about the same thing here when we talk about racism. Danelle Hopper would like to ask a question or make a comment. Join us.
Yeah, and maybe something to go in. I'm just really curious on one of the things that Dr. Williams said about where in the Bible is it say that skin color is a punishment? That was, and like I said, maybe it doesn't go along with what we're talking about today. I was just really like, where did that come from?
That's a really, really good question.
I would like to.
I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to ask that we hold that question, and I'm going to come back to you probably personally and see if we can unpack that question, and we might have that piece in the future. Okay? Very, very good. Very, very good question, though. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So I have a question for you all, and I'm asking for, you know, hands to be raised and comments to be made. We have only a few minutes left here. Monique Norris in our counseling has a comment. Do you want to make your comment, Monique? Oh, she's gone. I'm sorry. So my question here to our participants is, what is so hard to understand about systemic racism? And where do we go from here? Dr. Wyatt has his hand raised. Please join us. I'm not sure if he's...
Yeah, okay, I think I'm unmuted now. And the thing I would add to it is in a lot of my talkings with discussion with people and the courses that I teach, we look at individual versus systemic explanations for everything. And it's hard for people to grasp systems on any topic because in our culture, we are so focused on individuals as being responsible for their own fate, making their own decisions, rising up against the odds and overcoming whatever it may happen to be, that when we talk about any kind of a system problem, people struggle to understand it because it's too ambiguous and goes against a lot of the things that people have been taught. I don't really have an answer except to perhaps give a variety of examples of how systems work in opposition to people in different situations. But why it's hard is because I think of our culture's focus on individualism and the belief people have that they want to believe that an individual is responsible. You just think of people who get in trouble in a variety of ways or who are struggling in a variety of ways. Our default is to blame them for it, whether it's mental illness, whether it's poverty, whether it's they're struggling in school, whatever else it may happen to be. And when we try to point out larger system forces at work, people often view those as excuses or they view them as academic nonsense and are quick to dismiss them.
Very good, Dr. Wyatt. So the whole idea of rugged individualism has prevailed, and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make yourself great in this wonderful nation. And everybody has an equal shot at it, right? That's the general attitude. And so how in the world could one person not have that same opportunity just as someone else? Very, very good point. And I think that that gives us more reason to pause and to ask ourselves, why are things playing out in the way that they play out in terms of our different communities of people, social, economic status, poverty, having the knowledge and acumen to understand and navigate different opportunities, et cetera. Is there a real difference there? We've got two people who have raised their hands, Amari Johnson, one of our faculty, and then we'll have Dean Hammond. Go ahead. If you're able to unmute yourself.
I'm trying. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What I was going to say is that I think part of the reason that I agree with everything that Dr. Wyatt's already said. I would add to that when I've run into folks who have a difficult time understanding this idea of institutionalized racism or have a difficult time understanding privilege, it's because it's inimical to how they themselves are thinking. And so their assumption is that if institutionalized racism exists, then all people who are white must be racist. And they know that that's not how they think or how they feel or how they behave in their lives. And they don't understand that it doesn't matter what your personal opinions are in the system that we've got at present, that if you have lighter complected skin, you're benefiting in a whole host of ways, regardless of what you think, how you believe, or how you are acting on a daily basis. And that's, I think, the kicker right there is folks who reject that notion out of hand are assuming that institutionalized racism must mean that every single white person is the Ku Klux Klan or something, extreme like that. And it just isn't the case. In fact, I would argue that most people who have skin like my own in the United States are not necessarily vehemently anti-racist, but more like negligently benefiting. They don't have a white supremacist view. They don't think that people with darker skin are in some way lesser, but they also don't understand that they're automatically benefiting from the way our culture, our voting systems, our access to healthcare, our access to education, how all of these are set up. And that's the thing I think it's hard to shake people from, that it is possible to be even vehemently anti-racist and still, completely unbeknown to yourself, be benefiting from the system as it exists.
Of course. Thank you. Good point. Dean Hammond, did you have a remark?
I won't get into a lot of details. I kind of want to go back to what I said originally in terms of referring back to slavery, because a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, why are we going back to that? Why are we discussing that? And I don't believe that there is systemic racism. And I believe that is because people have not unpacked the systems. Because if you truly research and unpack the systems that the country is built on, you'll see and can create lines and linkages to everything that is happening today. And you will see all of the times throughout the historical timeline where the same activity has happened, right? And there's this vague, Dr. Wyatt mentioned that it's difficult to unpack the systems, right? That they're vague, they're broad, and people kind of shoo them off because I believe it's because they have not truly unpacked it. And quite frankly, the whole thing of systemic racism, it's not personal. I think people say, well, systemic racism doesn't exist because that's going to, implicate me. No, it is not personal. It is a system. It is a system, and that system exists no matter what. There are pieces of the original systems that the country was built on that manifest themselves in a multitude of ways. And that's, we've gone through revolutions over and over again, and this is merely another. And we will survive. We survived them before, and we will thrive because we've thrived before.
Good points. Thank you. Thank you, Dean Hammond. We have a few minutes here. We're going to close. I think that if we're at a point in our history again where we want to achieve equity and fairness and inclusion in these systems that are operating, the legal system, the economic system, the health system, the education system. There's mindsets that push for legislation to control the way these systems operate over generations. And those minds that originated our nation did, in fact, want these systems to thrive. The problem is we have to remember that those individuals, as great as they were, did not intend for all people to be considered human. When they said all men are created equal, they didn't intend for those that were created unequal and in their minds not human to be under that umbrella. So now we're at a point where we're revisiting that, and it's playing itself out in our policies and in our laws and how those laws are being enforced in those systems. So when we think about police and we see police brutality or abuse of authority, the police are people too. And they have families and they have lives and there are brothers and sisters, okay? So it's not really about the police, even though the police are symbolic of this policy that is being enforced to legally and justifiably keep a certain populations under control so that the system can benefit those that it was intended to originally, okay? So it doesn't matter if you're Black or white, if you're Hispanic or Asian. If you're a police officer, you're gonna do what the law tells you to do. It happened then, it happens now. It's not about that. It's about reforming the way that we think about public safety, reforming the way that we think about access and opportunity, reforming the way that we think about engaging in the American dream, and creating a real system that includes everyone. Okay, that's what this is really about. And education is a very important part of that. So when we think about education, we have our narrative in our history books and in the stories that we tell. But we need to be clear that that narrative intentionally excluded those points of view of those individuals that were not considered human. And over time, the story became true with those exclusions or them being erased or washed out. But it's not true. This is all American history. It's not Black history. It's not Hispanic history. It's not women's history. It's not Asian history. It's American history, you know, and we have to start telling the whole story so that our future generations will have an opportunity to set us on a more accurate course going forward. We have one more comment, and then I think we're going to close. It's Tracy Weck. I'm sorry, I can't say your name, Tracy. Go ahead, join us.
It's Wexelblatt. It's fine. I just wanted to say that everybody here, was lovely, and I really appreciate the discussion. But I also want to say that sometimes people are so lovely that they don't look at the other side of it. That part of the reason why it's hard to look at systemic racism is because it makes people uncomfortable, right? And when people feel uncomfortable, they close down and they get defensive. And it's hard to deal with that. And so, sometimes I feel like people use the word white privilege correctly. Like, it's privilege that I walk through the mall and people smile at me all the time. But it's racism that my friend walks into a store and is followed by security guards. We don't want to use some of these words, I think, some of the time because it makes us uncomfortable. And I think we have to feel okay feeling uncomfortable. I think it has to be okay for us to be uncomfortable in these discussions and know that we're going to make mistakes and have an agreement that we'll just keep coming back to the table. Because if we always make it nice, then I'm not really sure. Then I think what happens is that these movements flare up, but no one has any energy to continue them, right? Like, they flare up and there's like wonderful energy, but then things change 2% because people can't sustain that in the face of time. The only thing that is going to really make change is for people to like slog through it together and to be uncomfortable. And so it's nice. I appreciate, I have been walking around saying how nice you are, Dr. Allen. You're really nice. And you hear these questions and I'm very impressed with how nice you are, and gentle and kind. But sometimes it's okay, I think, for people to feel
uncomfortable.
Yeah,
I appreciate that, Tracy. And I will definitely keep that at the forefront of my mind. What I'm going to ask everyone who's listening on this in this conversation to do is keep it on their mind too. I'm not trying to set a tone necessarily for us to be nice, although although that's part of what I'm doing. The tone that I want to set is for us to be safe. And in that safe space, I believe that we'll begin to grapple with the deeper, more difficult and harder matters at hand. And because I've created a safe space, if I'm swinging my arms out of pain or emotion or hurt or frustration, and I end up hitting you, you won't take it on purpose. You won't take it as if I hit you on purpose. You'll just understand that is where I'm at. And if you do the same with me, then I won't take it as an intentional punch. And then we'll be able to grapple with these things together in the mud of it all. And we'll be able to come out on the other side knowing that we've grown together. Now, I can easily be hard, but I'm intentionally not. And I'm not going to make any apologies about when I'm not so gentle, because I've taken the time out to develop that foundation. And I want to challenge everyone to do exactly what Tracy is encouraging us to do, is stop being Kansas nice, and let's be real with each other about what it is we want to accomplish for our community and for ourselves. So the next opportunity that we have to come together, I appreciate Tracy saying what she said, we don't have to be so nice. We can talk about actions that we're going to take. We can grapple, we can challenge each other, we can push to the places that are uncomfortable, and then hold each other accountable when we see each other at the workplace, in our neighborhoods, and in our community. And that can be the expectation. And we don't have to be mean about it, but we don't have to be nice about it either. We can expect the best and hold each other to those standards. So with that, I think I'm going to close. It is nearly 20 minutes after 1. I think we've had a decent discussion, but I will have to admit there is so much more that we can do and that we need to do. So stay tuned. If you have any comments, please feel free to email me. My email is AALLEN29, that's AAllen29 @emporia.edu. I'd be happy to respond to anyone individually, and I look forward to the next time, maybe in about a week and a half or 2 weeks. Once again, I'm Dr. Allen, Chief Diversity Officer at Emporia State University, and I'm happy that we were able to have this conversation. Have a good afternoon, everyone.